Today is February 15th, 2018, and this is going to be about the present instead of the past. And it's pretty scary. But I do want to start out mentioning that 2 days ago was the anniversary of the bombing of Dresden. But it wasn't just Dresden. When the US/UK bombed Germany, they bombed over 100 cities. I think it's about that. I got as far as counting 60, then I got tired, and it wasn't much more than, maybe 2/3 down the list. So I'm guessing it was 100. Reduced to rubble. And you've heard of the phrase, past is prologue, so back to the present. Okay, we'll start out with a headline on Donald Trump, Commander-in-Chief. He just requested a budget of $716 billion in military spending for 2019. And he'll get it. Yeah, he'll get it. So let's just talk about how this works. The United States, as it turns out, is a corporation owned by bankers. So when your government borrows $716 billion, they borrow it from the Federal Reserve System, and they got to pay them back with interest. So my take on it is that this is just going to go on forever. Effectively, the country's not going to pay this back, but it does keep everything in check. So when you're that far in debt, you have no options. And of course, that's the idea. Now, according to the Trump doctrine, we have to sell military hardware because we're so broke. And that's all we got to sell, and we got to get out there on that market and make some money. So when he says we, he is not talking about you and me. He's talking about the big so-called defense companies. So I'm going to rattle off a few numbers just because it is startling. How your children's future is being mortgaged to these companies. There's a headline on Renegade that says that within the decade, the deficit will be 30 trillion. Well, when you think that 750 billion is being spent on arms, and that another 350 billion on keeping the new arrivals educated, medicated, and incarcerated, that adds up to about a cool trillion, and that's what's going down the shitter every year. So, just a little list. Bear with me. So, this is just a list of the top 5. Number 1 is Lockheed Martin. Arms sales, $35.7 billion. Total profit, $2.9 billion. So then behind them, there is Boeing. Arms sales, $31.4 billion. Total profit, $2.9 billion. Northrop Grumman is number 3, $28 billion in sales, $2 billion in profits, and I'm assuming this is annual. Okay, number 4, General Dynamics, $24 billion in arms sales, and $2.6 billion in a profit. And number 5 is Raytheon, with arms sales of $23 billion, total profits $1.9 billion. And of course, those arms go all over the world. That is the idea. So now I want to take a look at something I found on the internet from Global Security, and this is a think tank in DC. The guy that runs it is an Anglo. He seems pretty well intended. It tries to track arms. He's very mainstream, but I wouldn't think he would have a reason to lie. So we're going to take a look at the world's largest armies. Now this is looking at the number of men under arms, or people under arms, whatever, not the whole military infrastructure. This is just the actual boots on the ground, or boots that can get on the ground from any particular nation. And it's really fascinating. Of course, that isn't the whole picture. We have surveillance equipment provided all over the world by our best friend, Israel. And then of course there's just military infrastructure, and there's Navy, and there's Air Force. But this is still very indicative of where things are going. Donald Trump recently said that he wanted the EU, the European Union, to buy weapons from the United States, not the European nations, and there is a distinction. The European nations, in fact, are being disarmed in order to arm the European Union. And I will give you some numbers of European countries and the very small militaries they've got. Start out with the United Kingdom. They have 116,000 people under arms. Now, even let's take an African country by comparison. Let's take a look at Egypt. Now, Egypt was once part of the British Empire, and it was under British control between 1882 until 1956, so it wasn't even 75 years. But this nation, which is again a third world nation, has 310,000 men under arms. It has almost 3 times what the British do. And as far as populations go, the British have about 64 million and the Egyptians stand at about 97 million. So Egypt is about 30% higher in population, but it has 3 times the military. Let's take France. France has 103,000 people under arms, as opposed to their former colony, Algeria, which has 110,000 under arms. Again, an underdeveloped, almost third world nation. Compared to France. France and Britain are in the Security Council. They are supposedly top powers in the world. What is going on? And as for the populations, France has a population of about 67 million. Algeria has a population of about 41 million. So France is close to 75% greater, and yet their military is smaller. It's actually smaller. And then you have to consider the fact of how many Algerians are actually listed as French. Lots of Algerians, lots of Arabs in France, soon to become the next Islamic Republic of Europe. The next comparison I want to make is between Italy, which has 116,000 military, and Ethiopia, which has 200,000, twice as many. Now, Ethiopia has a population of 100 million, and Italy about 60 million, so it is considerably bigger. But what is interesting, it is a nation that has had recurrent problems with famine in 1972, in 1983 to 85, in 2002 and 2010, and there are all sorts of rationalizations, authoritarian government, small plot holdings, whatever. But despite that, they have this tremendous military. They can not feed their people, but they can have a large military. And to continue, Germany has 105,000, while the Democratic Republic of the Congo has 100,000. We're talking about one of the top economic nations in the world versus a squalid African country having the same number of men under arms. Very strange. Switzerland has 108,000 as opposed to Angola, which has 100,000, and again the same situation. As a matter of fact, of the top 46 nations with the biggest militaries, 9 of them are in Africa. And those 9 African nations have a grand total of 1.75 million men under arms, as opposed to the top European nations, who have only 658,000 men, women, whatever, under arms. So Africa is becoming more and more militarized as Europe is being intentionally demilitarized. Now, how about some of those drug exporting nations? How are they doing? Afghanistan has 352,000 men in the military, and Colombia has 235,000. So drugs and arms, yeah, they go together. They really do. Mexico has 212,000 right below the border, and they're getting $100 million worth of missiles and torpedoes. what are they going to do? They're going to torpedo the United States? Anyway, they're getting that from the U.S. So, how many does the U.S. have? The U.S. military, and they include in the U.S. military the Marine Corps, which other nations don't. It's hard to draw a clear analogy, but they do include the U.S. military and the U.S. Marine Corps, and with that, the U.S. has 1,235,900 men and women under arms. But they're not the biggest in the world. That position is held by North Korea, which supposedly has 1,300,000 men under arms. Very bizarre. So I don't know if this weird propaganda, I don't think this guy would put out intentional propaganda. He may be getting fed BS statistics. I find it hard to believe that North Korea has a bigger military than the U.S. How convenient this week, let's hope something doesn't happen, that they're being pitched as the biggest military in the world. Is this war propaganda? And the population of North Korea is only 25 million. So we're talking about almost 1 out of 20 people in that nation is the military. Makes no sense. Another one that's pitched, and this one is strange, is Syria. Syria is supposed to have 700,000. He has a series of question marks after that. Certain interests in this country have had their sights on these two countries for quite a while. And I've heard the rationalization for trying to cook up a war against Syria and against North Korea being that they're two of 4 holdouts that don't have the bank. Really, this crowd can run the world without including those little piss-ass nations in the banking cartel. So I don't think that's it. I'm not trying to denigrate their nations, but they're not powers in the world. Going down the list, our friend Israel has 633,000 men and women, and what else, God only knows, under arms. But anyway, that is as compared to Russia, which has 415,000. When the Soviet Union split, of course, they lost a lot of military. So that's interesting in and of itself. What else? What other nations have as many people under arms as the United States? India. India has 1,150,900. And then there's a question of the world's most populous country, China. And China, according to this, has only 850,000. That seems kind of strange. So let's talk about it. In this report, at the end of the list, it tells us that, somewhat surprisingly, the world's most populous country, China, seems not to have the world's largest army. No one seems to know the size of the Chinese army. According to some Western sources, such as the IISS military balance, the size of the Chinese ground forces is the largest in the world, with approximately 1.6 million personnel. That information comes from IISS, and that stands for International Institute for Strategic Studies, and they study military around the world. I don't know the money behind it, but anyway, just to go on with the conversation, IISS reports that about half this number are conscripts, while the other half are professional. In a white paper titled The Diversified Employment of China's Armed Forces, which was published by the State Council Information Office in May of 2013, the PLA, that is, the People's Liberation Army, disclosed the strength and formation of its ground force, air force, navy, and missile arm. According to the document, the 8th of its kind issued by the Chinese government since 1998, the mobile operational units of the PLA ground forces consisted of 18 combined corps and several independent combined combat divisions or brigades. These units were reported to demonstrate the transparency and openness of the Chinese military, to have a strength of 850,000. The U.S. Department of Defense seems to have split the difference, and it reports that there are 1.25 million active duty PLA personnel as of 2012. China on the 17th of April 2013 revealed the military strength of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, for the first time, saying it had 1.483 million personnel divided into 18 different corps. So what do you make of that? Anyway, it's somewhere obviously over 850,000. It could not possibly be that a nation the size of China, 1.3 billion people, or 1.4 billion by the latest count, would have half the military of North Korea, which has a population of 25 million. And Israel, of course, has been selling China American military hardware for God knows how long. So they could have a pretty high-class, world-class military at this point. Now I want to do some scenarios. And first of all, starting back in Europe and Africa. Now, I was listening to someone on the internet, and he was concerned about the Anglosphere. Fair enough. And he also seemed to take the attitude that all Europe had to do, as far as dealing with this mass invasion from Africa, and I did remember reading some time ago the number of 50 million Africans are expected to be exported to Europe. Now, he seemed to think that all the nations of, say, Spain and Italy and Greece had to do was turn these boats around, because they get there by boat, and imprison for a good long sentence the captains of these boats. But anyway, turn them around and send them back to where they came from and burn the boat. Okay, that sounds like it could work, but realistically, let's just say that those boats are not filled with these poor refugees, but are over time become filled with armed military young men. In most African nations, the biggest percentage of the population, up to 40%, are young men of military age and military training. Africa has been at war with itself since the end of the colonial era, and at any point in time, there are some 10 to 20 wars going on that continent, and they have militaries now. So what would stop them from loading those boats down with armed personnel? And don't forget that the European nations are being disarmed, and the people themselves are already disarmed, and they have no freedom of speech. And then you have the EU. Now, the EU is supposed to be the military to defend Europe. What Europe do they want to defend? They want to defend the Europe full of Africans and Arabs and everybody else. And in addition to that, Germany itself is an occupied nation, still occupied by the American military. So now let's go back to Northeast Asia, where all those highly armed nations live. Okay, so if you take the Chinese, even round it out to 1.25 million soldiers in arms, and then you take North Korea, let's just say it's only 1 million. So you got 2.25 right there. Now, I have read on this global security website that South and North Korea are making overtures. In other words, they'd like to bury the hatchet and go be one nation again, because they are a people. They are a people, an ethnicity with a heritage, a language, and they were chopped up after World War II because of the machinations behind the scenes. So if they want to get back together, it actually makes a lot of sense. South Korea, having lived in fear all these years, has a military of 500,000. Again, for a small country. So we're up to 2.75 million soldiers under arms in that little piece of Northeast Asia. Japan, by contrast, only has 152,000 soldiers under arms. Of course, they're being punished for being bad in World War II, like the Germans. So, but they're our ally. You know, none of this makes sense. But anyway, why would they be? Why don't they hate us? Anyway, so I'm thinking that these people could turn. But in any case, it's perfectly obvious that the Trump administration is desperate to get a war going against North Korea, which actually this country's been running these, the media, our friends in the media, who are they, are running these headlines, North Korea's got lobbing off nukes at Japan, and so on and so forth. I just right now want to take a moment to look back in history, not all of it, but people who watch this stuff on the net, you know that every war in the world's gotten, or the last couple hundred years, gotten off the ground using false flag operation. For instance, World Wars I and II in Europe were basically one big war, and it was a supposed Serbian who was actually Jewish who assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, the Serbs would have been backed up by Russia because they were all Slavs. The Austro-Hungarian Empire looked to its mentors, Germany or Prussia. So right there you got the war off the ground. And so Europe was destroyed. Now, what's going to be destroyed this time if there's some false flag operation and they accuse North Korea of starting World War, whatever, is it 3 or 4? And of course, the North Koreans are supposedly in cahoots with the Syrians, so we would have to go to North Korea and destroy it to save our best friends, the Israelis. Anyway, Israel actually in one of their internet outlets, Allgemeiner, there was a headline saying that as far as they're concerned, that is the Israelis, the war against Iran has already started. So that's today, the 15th of February. Not encouraging. America has the biggest military in the world. Unfortunately, it's never been used to actually protect the American people. At least a third of them are overseas, and in fact, those are the best troops. Those are the special ops. Those are the guys who are really top-notch soldiers, and they're overseas because part of the PNAC plan outlined that the future would be full of small or low-intensity conflicts. And that's that's the game we've gotten trapped in for decades. Afghanistan and Syria and Libya and blah, blah, blah. And that's why we are so hated in the world. And this is very, very dangerous. The PNAC document, of course, most of you probably know this, Project for a New American Century. It was put together by the neocons or neo-Straussians after 9/11, and the 6 out of the 11 principals are Jewish, yes. The big heavies on this were David Epstein, Paul Wolfowitz, William Kristol, Robert Kagan, Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Perle, Francis Fukuyama, John Bolton, Dick Cheney, Jeb Bush, and Stephen Forbes. But why North Korea? Why would we care one way or the other? It is a kind of silly little country halfway around the globe. What I think is that this is a big setup. Israel's been arming China. We're not getting the straight dope on that, on how much military they really have. North Korea is the excuse. If North Korea does something and America does something in response, then China has to come in on it. And there we are in the northeast corner of Asia with our how many troops fighting almost 3 million soldiers in arms. This is not a good scenario. It's a possibility. This is conjecture, but I have to put these pieces together and look at history and look at this insane thing that's going on in this country right now. And the anti-Russian propaganda is incessant. It's also part of this. What possible point is there for the U.S. to go to war against Russia, Iran, China? None. But you know what? We're done if we do. And Russia's probably done too. Russia spends 10% of what the U.S. does in the military, so they're naturally, and they've been driven into the arms of Iran and China. Anyway, on the way back home, we can stop by the Indo-Chinese Peninsula. That is where the countries of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand are. And interestingly enough, I just have to point this out, Vietnam has 410,000 soldiers under arms. Of course, you can say that countries that have been through long years of war are going to be heavily armed. Let me see here. Cambodia has 110,000. A little weird, dysfunctional Cambodia has 110,000 and Thailand has 190,000. So that's over 700,000 troops under arms in that little peninsula. So we'll have to drive by there on the way home if we're coming back on our big boats. And on the south side of Russia, of course, there's been incessant war. A lot of that has been triggered by Israel, of course. There were Israelis and American troops in Georgia when that country was ripped apart. And it had been Christian allied with Russia, and it's becoming increasingly Muslim. They were also American troops and Israeli troops in Tajikistan, another little country out south of Russia. And of course, there's the involvement in the destruction of the Ukraine and the dismemberment. And even more interesting is Kazakhstan is a huge country. It's on the southeastern border of Russia. It's one of the longest borders between two countries, the one between Russia and Kazakhstan. Of course, Israel has set up a military relationship with Kazakhstan. They have some 60 defense companies in there hustling their wares. That started some good 10 years ago. So yeah, I mean, all this stuff, it's going on behind the scenes. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody kind of knows about it. But I just sense we're getting set up for the big one. The headline that I mentioned comes from not the Allgemeiner, but from the Jerusalem Post. It says, "The war with Iran has begun. Come hear what the Israeli defense minister has to say." Another anomaly in this list is Singapore. Singapore is a city-state in Malaysia, and it's independent though, and it has 350,000 troops. The population of Singapore is 5 million. So per capita, they win. They definitely win. And it also tells us, I was curious what the GDP of Singapore was, and it is rated as the second least miserable country in the world, and that is because it has a GDP of $316 billion US. That's for 2018. They're doing okay. It's super, super modern. It's a banking center, but they're covered. They have their own military. And now that I'm curious about this, I decided to check out Hong Kong's GDP. And that's a city, too. It's not in China, but it's on the edge of China. So anyway, I don't know its exact status. It's independent. Anyway, city-state, I guess. Anyway, its GDP is $320 billion, and that was as of 2016, so they're doing good, too. I don't know if they have their own military. They do have their own triads, and Chinese triad, their own secret societies. So, yeah, okay, that's Hong Kong. Now, I thought, well, I'd just do New York City. Now, I know that's not an independent country within the United States, or is it? Anyway, so New York, and this is not the city, this is the state, has the real GDP, it says. 2016 was $1,275 billion. So New York is still number one. They don't have their own military yet. Well, they kind of do. The U.S. military is their military. So I just thought those were interesting little details. So now that I've gotten started on this, I thought I'd do London. London is like the capital of the universe. But I was surprised to find out, and I got this from Wikipedia. So anyway, what they tell us is that London, in US dollars, billions, is worth $542 billion, and that's what its GDP was as of 2014. Now, the Brookings Institute says they're worth $835 billion in that same year, so I don't know. I'm not sure, but anyway, so New York still seems to be number one. Interesting. New York City, United States, according to this, is worth, in 2016, it was worth $1,735 billion. Wikipedia puts them at one. That was Wikipedia. And the Brookings Institute says they're worth $1,403 billion. Anyway, a lot more than I'm worth. So now that I have this list, I thought I'd check out some of those third world locations. Kinshasa, that's in the Congo, I think it's the capital, that's not worth anything. And Kabul in Afghanistan has no value. They have no GDP, but they do have a military, one of the largest in the top 46 nations in the world. I don't know. It's all kind of fishy. Oh, you know what? I also thought they don't in this listing list the city of London. That's where the real bucks are. That's it. Okay, swinging back to stateside. I thought I just mentioned that Mexico has a military of 212,000. And I think I mentioned at the beginning that we were going to sell them stuff, military stuff, $100 million worth. Israel is also helping out. Thanks, guys. And they are selling them, or did sell them a couple years ago, rather, a communication surveillance system. So that should help the drug lords. The rationale for America selling them all the military equipment is that they're a strategic partner. I'm not quite sure how. They can't even keep their own drug gangs under control. Yeah, okay, whatever. Just to recap, I want to remind people what to think about. First, the countries that are being militarized are the exact opposite of those that had the power 100 years ago. European countries are being disarmed. African countries are being heavily armed, even when they don't seem to be able to afford it. And other countries that are being armed are drug exporting countries, or are acquiring large militaries in comparison to their place in the world, on the world stage. Afghanistan, Vietnam. Now, that may be because of the wars, may also be because of proximity to the Golden Triangle. And Colombia, Mexico. The other thing that I'm noticing is that in this trip back from the East, I'm not sure what all of this nonsense about North Korea is all about. But I don't think it's because North Korea is going to destroy the world, or that it's a threat to the United States. So I don't know what the ulterior motive is. There is a waterway, a narrow waterway between the Korean Peninsula and Japan. And waterways are some of the places you find big militaries. And there's that one. Then there's the passage you have to go through near the Indo-Chinese peninsula between two Malaysian islands. So then that's a bottleneck, or it's a shipping lane, and shipping lanes are crucial. Anyway, you go keep going west, there's Bombay. Keep going farther west and you have two shipping lanes. One is if you go through the Gulf of Eden and up through the Red Sea, you then come to the Suez Canal. That's a very crucial shipping lane, and that is controlled, or Egypt has a pretty big military. And of course then there's Israel on the other side, and Israel is a de facto controller of Egypt and has a huge military. So that's absolutely crucial to world trade. And then of course the other one is the Persian Gulf, which isn't a shipping lane, but it's crucial to getting the oil out of the Middle East and onto the world, which could be one of the reasons, if not the reason, for the war against Iran. The other thing that strikes me is all these locations, Singapore with a military, and then Hong Kong, Shanghai, these have all been part of the British Empire, and they're banking cities. That's what they are. And of course they're all crucial to the world trade. And so then also another one that I haven't mentioned, but South Africa. And South Africa's location, it was originally, when the Boer people went there from Holland and Germany and France, and became the Boer people in South Africa, that was the drop-off point for trade coming from the east and having to round the African continent, and that was a vital refilling and stop for provisions. And that's another story. But all these places are just very much part of this world trade network. Another one I did mention is the Panama Canal, and there are a lot of, particularly American patriot point of view, is that we essentially gave that to China. I mean, supposedly Panama controls the Panama Canal, but Panama is not a power, so there's somebody behind that. So anyway, that's part of the reason for this strange set of countries that are militarized. Another strange location is Afghanistan, and a lot of people like to blame that exclusively on the heroin trade, but actually the Golden Triangle provides a lot more of it. So I think that's part of it, and we have been super saturated with heroin. Heroin addiction is skyrocketing in Europe and in the United States. But there's also the other part of that, which is its location close to Russia. And one of the 19th century games was called the Great Game, and this was pretty much engineered by Disraeli as advisor to Victoria to make sure to get India, because the Russians wanted it. So it turned into a Russian-English battle, and that had, of course, has continued right on into the 20th century, and even now. What I see is just pre-planning and organizing the world. The very fact that India and China are becoming the centers for production, that was thought out in the 19th century. But anyway, I've mentioned that in other audios. It is fascinating to tie these pieces of the puzzle together. The last thing I want to talk about is the role of the Anglo-Saxon nations in this. Britain, of course, and America. It seems like we are really just handmaidens to the Lord, as it were. Britain, of course, built the British Empire, and that has really laid the tracks for this global trade network. And this is the world of transnationals, the bank, the international banking cartel. And America seems to be as mercenary forces for anything our controllers want. And it's really sad. I mean, America's naturally the most protected power in the world. I mean, we had Canada to the north, not a threat, and Mexico, now a threat. But really, and we're not even protected from the Mexicans, but we spend 10 times as much as the nearest competitor, Russia, on arms. It's crazy, and it's not to protect the nation and its people. We have 900 bases overseas. It's crazy. It's just built on the backs of the American taxpayer. So there it is. People have used some pretty crude terms, about America as Israel's bitch. It's an ugly thing to say, but fact is, it really is that. And I'm not referring just to Israel the state, because the Jews are not dependent on Israel the state. I mean, it's part of their larger game plan, but so few Jews even live there. The state of Israel is dependent on Jewish power. That's how it works. And it's a global financial and trade power network that is phenomenally strong.